This week, Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado officially launched his campaign for governor, setting the stage to challenge his current boss, Governor Kathy Hochul, in the Democratic primary. The move comes just a few months after a public split between the two. Back in February, Delgado announced that he would not be running on Hochul's ticket in 2026. Now, with just about a year until the Democratic primary, Delgado is looking to get support from voters. In a campaign announcement video, the lieutenant governor said that New Yorkers needed, quote, a bold, decisive, and transformational leader. To discuss the news of Delgado challenging Hochul and the political implications, we are joined by Rebecca Lewis of City and State New York. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Now, can you help us understand how did we get here in which we're seeing the lieutenant governor challenging the governor to lead the state?
That's a long story, but it's an interesting one. I mean, it starts all the way back. I think someone on Twitter had actually had a timeline that it goes all the way back to Spitzer, and his fall from grace got us to where we are now. The relationship between the Governor Hochul, and her lieutenant governor, her hand-picked lieutenant governor, has been pretty rocky for most of their tenure. It's whether that's because ultimately they didn't get along, or he bristled under her leadership. You know, that's for closed room discussions, but it became very clear, especially at the end of last year, that they were no longer seeing eye to eye. I think that one of the first big public breaks was when Antonio Delgado decided to say that Joe Biden should drop out as the Democratic nominee, even as Governor Hochul remained one of his staunchest supporters. And from there, it just continued to drift apart. I think none of us were surprised when he announced that he was running for governor. We were all expecting it, but this isn't entirely unusual. It's not the first time that governors and lieutenant governors have disagreed, and it's not even the first time when a lieutenant governor has decided to run for governor themselves, but it's always interesting to see.
And given the fact that it wasn't a surprise, as you mentioned, what did you think of the rollout of the campaign and the messaging?
The rollout was a little odd. It came out, it seemed clear that they wanted to launch it with an exclusive in the New York Times and then a follow-up interview with New York One in New York City. But the New York Post came out with a anonymously sourced story first. And this was early evening on a Monday, seemed like an odd time to launch. It was the day before, or 2 days before, the first New York City mayoral, Democratic primary mayoral debate. And that's also been getting most of the attention, certainly downstate, but it's New York City. So that race has been getting a lot of attention regardless, especially as President Donald Trump is in some ways getting involved too. So the timing has been a little unusual, but it gives him lots of runway to get his message out, to get his name out there, because he has a long way to go to get his name recognition up. And it's very clear that he is charting a left-wing path. He is going to be challenging the governor from the left. He's going to be pushing for some progressive policies and trying to hit her where she's vulnerable with those more left-wing communities.
And the most interesting part about this for me was the slew of elected officials and lawmakers who came out once the campaign was announced, and they said that they were supporting the governor. What did you make of these political moves?
You know, it's not entirely surprising to see that the leader of the state party, the incumbent governor, first female governor, is getting support, but it's not every day that you necessarily see an announcement from a challenger and then all of the endorsements are for the incumbent or the person that they're running against. It's certainly a show of support for the governor. It makes it clear that the institutional Democrats are going to be behind her, that she will have support from elected officials. even in Albany, where she's not always necessarily everyone's favorite person in the legislature, that she is going to have a lot of the support. And Delgado, his campaign has said they're not trying to get those endorsements anyway. They want to run with a grassroots campaign. Now, whether that's, them trying to make light of all these endorsements coming out for the governor and singing her praises, or if they genuinely recognize that this was going to be the situation, it's clear that he will have to rely on some of the more grassroots organizing if he wants to challenge Hochul and her prodigious fundraising and institutional support.
And how do you think this campaign from the lieutenant governor sort of impacts other candidates who are vying for the Democratic nominee?
There's really one main potential candidate at this point who has not yet announced, and that's Congressman Richie Torres. But the further along we go, the less likely it seems like he might decide to actually jump in. And it's very possible that with Delgado making it official, perhaps others decide they don't want to bother, don't want to try. And certainly if he takes up the left-wing position and if he starts to get the backing from prominent left-wing groups, there is probably less likely to be another challenger from the left. Of course, it's not impossible, but if he starts consolidating that support, it might discourage other potential progressives from jumping in. And whether or not that impacts what Torres ultimately decides to do, it's hard to say. He's definitely going to run more aligned with the governor, less so a progressive challenge.
And lastly, in the time that we have left, how do you think this impacts the governor as she leads the state and also gears up for re-election?
It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see the governor and her lieutenant going head-to-head in a campaign like this. But she's already basically stripped Delgado of what limited official authority he had as her number two. He hasn't really been acting in an official capacity representing her in quite some time. Now, that's not to say he hasn't been around the state. He hasn't been using his title as lieutenant governor, that he's not still lieutenant governor. But it might make things a little bit even more tense. He said at his rally in Brooklyn the other day that he hasn't spoken to the governor in quite some time. And it might bring out, a competitive side in the governor, and we might start seeing a little bit more jabbing, whether directly or indirectly from her campaign. So we might start to see her begin shifting into that campaign mode even more than she already has been with some of her messaging.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. Love coming on.
And we were speaking with Rebecca Lewis of City and State New York.